I was standing in my driveway at 7 in the morning, coffee in hand, watching my contractor's truck pull up to start work on my deck renovation when Linda Pemberton came storming across the street like a woman possessed. "Stop right there," she shrieked, her voice cutting through the peaceful Saturday morning in our Scottsdale, Arizona neighborhood. "You do not have permission to proceed with this construction." I felt my jaw tighten as I watched her march up to my property line, her highlighted blonde hair perfectly styled despite the early hour, her manicured finger pointing at my contractor like she was about to smite him with divine judgment. Linda had been the president of our Pinecrest Estates HOA for the past 3 years, and in that time, she had made it her personal mission to terrorize every homeowner who dared to breathe without her explicit approval. "Good morning, Linda," I said, keeping my voice level. "As I'm sure you're aware from the approval form I submitted 6 weeks ago, I'm having my back deck rebuilt today." "That approval was conditional," she snapped, not even looking at me as she focused her glare on my contractor, a weathered man in his 50s named Tom Martinez who had built half the custom homes in Scottsdale. "And I'm revoking it as of this moment." Tom glanced at me with raised eyebrows, clearly wondering if he should start unloading his equipment or get back in his truck. I held up a hand to him, signaling him to wait, and turned my full attention to Linda. "The approval letter I received had no conditions listed," I said, walking over to stand beside Tom's truck. "It was a standard approval with the requirement that I use materials matching the architectural guidelines, which I am. Tom has the exact specifications." Linda finally turned her ice-blue eyes on me, and I could see the fury radiating off her like heat waves off Arizona asphalt in July. "The board held an emergency meeting last night. We've decided that your project poses a risk to neighborhood aesthetics and property values. Your approval is hereby suspended pending further review." An emergency meeting. I felt my blood pressure rising. "Let me guess, you didn't notify me of this meeting, did you?" "We don't need to notify homeowners of every board decision," she said smugly. "It's in the bylaws, Section 12, Paragraph 4. The board reserves the right to convene emergency sessions when matters of urgent concern arise." I had read those bylaws front to back when I bought my house 2 years ago. That section specifically states that emergency meetings can only be called for genuine emergencies affecting health, safety, or security. My deck renovation doesn't qualify, and you know it. Her face flushed red, clashing with her coral lipstick. "I'm the president of this HOA, and I determine what constitutes an emergency. Now, I'm ordering you and your contractor to cease all activity immediately, or I'll be forced to take legal action." Tom cleared his throat beside me. "Look, folks, I don't want to get in the middle of anything. I've got the permits from the city, and I've got a signed approval letter from the HOA. If there's a problem, maybe you two can work it out and you can give me a call when you're ready." "No," I said firmly. "We're not delaying this project. Linda, I followed every single rule. I submitted my application with detailed plans. I waited the required review period. I received written approval. You can't just arbitrarily revoke that approval because you feel like it. Watch me," she hissed. Then she pulled out her phone and started taking pictures of Tom's truck, the building materials he'd started to unload, and my property. "I'm documenting this violation. Every day you proceed without proper authorization, you'll be fined $500. And if you continue after I've issued a cease and desist, I'll place a lien on your property." That's when I knew this wasn't about the deck at all. This was about what had happened 3 months ago at the HOA meeting where I'd challenged her authority in front of the entire neighborhood. Linda had tried to push through a new rule requiring all homeowners to use her husband's landscaping company for any yard work exceeding $500. The conflict of interest was blatant, and I'd stood up at the meeting and called her out on it. I'd even brought a copy of the Arizona HOA laws that explicitly prohibited board members from using their position for personal financial gain. The proposal had been voted down, and Linda had given me a look that could have melted steel. This was her revenge, and she declared war today. "Tom, start unloading," I said, making my decision. "We're proceeding as planned. You'll regret this," Linda warned, her voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "I will make your life a living hell." "You already do that to everyone in this neighborhood," I replied. "But I'm done letting you bully people. Do your worst." She spun on her designer heels and stalked back toward her house, already dialing a number on her phone. I knew exactly who she was calling, her husband, Richard, who happened to be a lawyer. Not a particularly successful one from what I'd heard, but he loved throwing around legal threats almost as much as Linda loved wielding her HOA power. Tom looked at me seriously. "You sure about this, buddy? HOA disputes can get ugly real fast." "I'm sure," I said. "I've got everything documented. She's abusing her authority and someone needs to stand up to her." We spent the rest of the morning demolishing my old deck. It was a mess, rotted in several places and honestly dangerous. That's why I'd prioritized getting it replaced. My girlfriend Sarah and I loved to host barbecues, and the last thing I wanted was for someone to fall through the deteriorating boards. Around noon, a certified letter arrived. Linda had apparently paid extra for same-day delivery. Inside was a formal cease and desist order, signed by her and the two other board members, Margaret Chen and David Morrison. I'd met both of them briefly at HOA meetings. Margaret seemed reasonable enough, a retired schoolteacher who mostly went along with whatever Linda wanted to avoid conflict. David was Linda's loyal lapdog, a nervous accountant who nodded enthusiastically at everything she said. The letter claimed that my project violated HOA Architectural Guidelines Section 7, which required that all outdoor structures maintain visual harmony with surrounding properties. It stated that my approved plans had been reviewed again and found to be in violation of aesthetic standards. The letter demanded immediate cessation of all construction activity and threatened daily fines starting at $500 and increasing by $100 each subsequent day. I took photos of the letter and texted them to my attorney, Marcus Webb. Marcus and I had gone to Arizona State University together, and he'd helped me with the closing on my house. He was a real estate attorney who dealt with his fair share of HOA disputes. My phone rang 5 minutes later. "This is complete garbage," Marcus said without preamble. "She can't retroactively revoke an approval she already granted, and this aesthetic harmony clause is so vague it would never hold up in court. She's banking on you being too intimidated to fight back." "Well, she picked the wrong guy," I said. "What are my options?" "Keep detailed records of everything. Every interaction, every letter, every expense. Don't communicate with her except in writing from now on, and definitely don't stop construction. If she actually tries to fine you, we'll challenge it. The worst-case scenario is we end up in arbitration or court, and honestly, I think we'd win easily." "What about the lien threat?" I asked. "She can't place a lien without going through the proper legal channels, which would require proving you actually violated the rules. Since you didn't, she won't get that far. She's just trying to scare you." I felt better after talking to Marcus, but I also knew this was just the beginning. Linda wasn't the type to back down easily. That evening, after Tom and his crew had left for the day, having made significant progress on the demolition and framing, I found a note taped to my front door. It was handwritten in Linda's distinctive angular script. "Your blatant disregard for community standards is noted. The board will be meeting Monday evening to discuss further action regarding your violations. Your presence is not required nor desired." The petty hostility of that last line almost made me laugh. She couldn't even maintain professional language in an official HOA communication. Sarah came over for dinner that night, and I filled her in on the day's events while we grilled burgers on my ancient portable grill, since the deck was currently just a skeleton of new framing. "She's insane," Sarah said, shaking her head. Her dark curls caught the evening light, and I was reminded again how lucky I was to have someone so level-headed in my life. I've heard stories about nightmare HOAs, but this is next level. The thing that kills me is how many people in this neighborhood just go along with her because they're afraid, I said. Mrs. Patterson 3 doors down wanted to paint her shutters a slightly different shade of gray, and Linda made her life so miserable that she just gave up. And remember the Johnsons. They moved out last year partly because Linda kept citing them for having their trash cans visible from the street for more than 24 hours. You know what you need to do, Sarah said thoughtfully. You need to really look into her background. People like this usually have skeletons in their closet. I bet if you dig into how she runs the HOA, you'll find other violations, maybe even some that matter to the city. That got me thinking. The next day, Sunday, I spent several hours going through the HOA's public records. As a homeowner in the association, I had the right to review financial documents, meeting minutes, and correspondence. I drove to Margaret Chen's house, since she was listed as the HOA secretary and was responsible for maintaining records. Margaret answered the door in gardening gloves, looking surprised to see me. "Oh, hello. Can I help you?" "Hi, Margaret. I'm sorry to bother you on a Sunday, but I wanted to request copies of the HOA financial records and board meeting minutes for the past 2 years. As a homeowner, I'm entitled to review them." Her expression became uncomfortable. "Well, normally Linda handles those requests. Perhaps you should email her. According to the bylaws, any board member can provide access to association records," I said politely but firmly. "I'd prefer not to wait. I can come back with a formal written request if needed, but I thought we could keep this simple." She hesitated, then sighed. "Let me see what I have. Wait here." She disappeared into her house and returned 10 minutes later with a thumb drive. "These are the files I have." The financial records and meeting minutes. I should tell you, though, that Linda isn't going to be happy about this. "I appreciate your help," I said, taking the drive. "And Margaret, can I ask you something? Do you really think my deck renovation violates aesthetic standards?" She looked down at her gardening gloves. "Honestly, no, your plans looked fine to me, but Linda was very insistent that we needed to revoke the approval. She said you were being disrespectful to the board's authority." "I followed every rule," I said. "She's retaliating against me because I challenged her at that meeting about her husband's landscaping company." Margaret nodded slowly. "I know, and for what it's worth, I'm sorry, but Linda can make life very difficult for board members who don't support her. I'm just trying to keep the peace." It was a depressing insight into how Linda maintained power through intimidation, but it also made me more determined to expose whatever wrongdoing I might find. That evening, I went through the files Margaret had given me. What I found was illuminating, to say the least. The financial records showed several questionable transactions. There were regular payments to Pemberton Consulting LLC for administrative services, totaling almost $15,000 over 18 months. A quick business registry search revealed that Pemberton Consulting was registered to Richard Pemberton, Linda's husband, and had been formed just weeks after Linda became HOA president. There were also payments to a law firm called Davidson and Associates for legal advisory services that seemed excessive for a small residential HOA. When I looked up the firm, I discovered it was Richard's firm. He was of counsel there, meaning he was affiliated but not a partner. The payments totaled over $20,000 in 2 years, but the real bombshell was what I found in the meeting minutes from 8 months ago. There had been a proposal to renovate the community pool house, which was shared property maintained by HOA fees. The approved contractor was listed as Martinez Construction Services, with a bid of $45,000. I recognized the name instantly because my contractor, Tom Martinez, had mentioned he sometimes did commercial work. I called Tom that evening. "Hey, this might be a weird question, but did you ever do work on the pool house at Pinecrest Estates, the community pool house?" Tom sounded confused. "No, I bid on that job, but I didn't get it. Someone underbid me by about $5,000. Why?" Because the meeting minutes say your company did the work, and the HOA paid out $45,000 for it. There was a long silence. That's not possible. I never did that job. In fact, I remember being annoyed because the project never seemed to happen at all. The pool house is still in rough shape. My heart was racing. Tom, this is important. Do you still have your original bid documents? Sure, I keep everything. Let me dig them up and send them over. Within an hour, I had Tom's bid in my email. His original quote had been $47,000 for comprehensive renovations to the pool house, including new roofing, updated plumbing, modern fixtures, and fresh paint throughout. The bid that had supposedly been accepted was for $45,000 for the same scope of work. I drove over to the community pool area. It was dark, but the streetlights provided enough illumination. The pool house looked exactly as shabby as it had when I'd moved in 2 years ago. The roof had visible damage, the paint was peeling, and one of the bathroom doors hung crooked on its hinges. No renovation had ever taken place, but $45,000 had been paid out to a contractor who never did the work. I spent the rest of Sunday evening documenting everything. I made copies of all the files, cross-referenced payments with dates, and compiled a detailed timeline of questionable financial transactions. By midnight, I had evidence of what appeared to be embezzlement, self-dealing, and fraud totaling over $80,000. Monday morning, I emailed everything to Marcus. He called me before noon, his voice tight with excitement. This is huge. Like potentially criminal huge, Linda has been using the HOA as her personal piggy bank. The payments to her husband's consulting company are a clear conflict of interest and probably violate Arizona HOA statutes. The fake pool house renovation is outright fraud. You need to report this to the Arizona Department of Real Estate, which oversees HOAs, and you might want to consider reporting it to the police. What about my deck situation? I asked. Oh, that's the least of her problems now, Marcus said with grim satisfaction. But if you want to twist the knife, I have an idea. Does Linda have any construction projects of her own going on? I thought about it. Actually, yeah, she's been building some kind of addition on the back of her house. I've seen construction crews there for the past month. Perfect. Go to the Scottsdale Planning Department and check if she pulled the proper permits. I have a feeling someone who's been embezzling from the HOA might have cut corners elsewhere too. I took a long lunch break and drove to the Scottsdale Planning and Development Services office. After waiting in line and explaining what I needed, a helpful clerk pulled up the records for Linda's address. The clerk said, frowning at his computer screen. There's no active building permit for this address. There was one that expired 2 years ago for a bathroom renovation, but nothing current. Is it possible the permit is under a different name? I asked. He checked a few more things. No, there's nothing. If they're doing construction without a permit, that's a violation. You can file a complaint and we'll send an inspector out. I'd like to do that, I said. He handed me a form, and I filled it out, providing Linda's address and a description of the construction activity I'd observed. The clerk stamped it and assured me an inspector would visit within 2 business days. I left the planning office feeling like I just lit a very large fuse on a very powerful explosive. That evening was the HOA board meeting Linda had mentioned in her note. Even though she'd said my presence wasn't required, I showed up anyway, along with Marcus, who I'd asked to accompany me as my legal counsel. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a modest building near the pool. About a dozen homeowners were scattered in the folding chairs, most looking bored or resigned. Linda sat at the head table with Margaret and David, looking supremely confident until I walked in with Marcus. Her expression darkened immediately. This is a closed board meeting, she announced. Homeowners may observe but not participate unless invited to speak. That's fine, I said, taking a seat in the front row. We're here to observe. Linda's jaw clenched, but she couldn't really object without looking even more tyrannical. She shuffled her papers and called the meeting to order. The first 15 minutes were boring routine business, approving minutes from the last meeting and discussing landscaping maintenance schedules. Then Linda cleared her throat dramatically. Item 7 on the agenda. Ongoing violations at 4782 Seguero Drive. That was my address. The homeowner at this location has proceeded with unpermitted construction despite a cease and desist order from this board. I'm recommending we impose the maximum allowable fines and pursue all available legal remedies, including placing a lien on the property. Point of order, Marcus said, standing up. I'm Marcus Webb, attorney for the homeowner in question. I'd like to present evidence that the construction in question was properly approved by this board and that the subsequent attempted revocation of that approval was improper and potentially unlawful. Linda's face went red. You're out of order. Homeowners and their representatives are not permitted to speak unless invited. Then I invite him to speak, I said. According to the bylaws, any homeowner can request to address the board during a meeting. Margaret leaned over and whispered something to Linda, probably reminding her that I was right. Linda looked like she wanted to explode, but she forced a tight smile. Fine. You have 3 minutes. Marcus pulled out copies of my original approval letter, the timeline of my application and approval, and the relevant sections of the HOA bylaws and Arizona state laws governing HOA authority. He laid out a clear, devastating argument that Linda had abused her authority and that any fines or liens would be challenged in court, where the HOA would almost certainly lose and potentially be liable for my legal fees and damages. The other homeowners in the room were paying attention now, several of them whispering to each other. Furthermore, Marcus continued, we have evidence that raises serious questions about this board's financial management and potential misuse of HOA funds. We'll be requesting a full independent audit of the association's finances and filing complaints with the appropriate state authorities. David looked confused, but Margaret had gone pale. Linda's expression was pure fury. Are you threatening this board? Linda demanded. I'm informing the board that my client intends to exercise his rights under Arizona law, Marcus said calmly. If those rights are violated, we will seek appropriate legal remedies. This meeting is adjourned, Linda snapped, slamming her hand on the table. You can't adjourn in the middle of the agenda, one of the other homeowners called out. It was Bob Harrison, a retired engineer who lived on my street. We haven't voted on anything yet. I'm the president and I'm adjourning this meeting, Linda said, standing up and gathering her papers. Actually, under Robert's Rules of Order, which your bylaws state govern board meetings, you need a motion and a second to adjourn, Marcus said. Otherwise, the meeting continues. Linda looked like her head might actually explode. Margaret and David looked thoroughly uncomfortable, clearly not sure what to do. I motion to adjourn, David squeaked out. I second, Linda said immediately. All in favor? Margaret said quickly. She and David raised their hands. Linda was already walking toward the door. The meeting dissolved into chaos as homeowners started calling out questions about the financial audit Marcus had mentioned. I could see several of them pulling out their phones, probably to start Googling Arizona HOA laws. As we left, Bob Harrison caught up with me. Is it true? Has Linda been stealing from the HOA? I have evidence of questionable financial transactions that need to be investigated, I said carefully. I'm filing a complaint with the state, and I'd encourage other homeowners to request access to the financial records and review them yourselves. I knew something was off, Bob said. She's been so aggressive about raising our HOA fees, but nothing ever seems to improve around here. The pool house is still a wreck, the landscaping barely gets maintained, and half the streetlights don't work. Word spread fast in our small neighborhood. By Tuesday morning, I'd received emails and calls from at least 8 other homeowners asking about the financial irregularities. I referred them all to the HOA bylaws section on records access and suggested they request copies from Margaret. Meanwhile, Tom and his crew continued working on my deck. The framing was nearly complete, and it looked fantastic. The new structure was solid and level, built to code and matching the architectural style of my house perfectly. Tuesday afternoon, I was at work when I got a call from an unknown Scottsdale number. "This is Inspector Rodriguez from the City of Scottsdale Planning and Development," a professional voice said. "I'm calling about the complaint you filed regarding unpermitted construction at 4821 Saguaro Drive. I visited the property this morning and confirmed that there is active construction occurring without proper permits. I've issued a stop work order, and the property owner has been notified that she needs to apply for the appropriate permits and inspections before proceeding. If she doesn't comply, she'll face daily fines and potential legal action." I felt a surge of vindication. "Thank you for following up, Inspector." I should also mention that when I informed the property owner of the violation, she became quite hostile and insisted that she didn't need permits because she's the HOA president. I had to explain that HOA authority has nothing to do with city building codes. She was not happy. I could imagine the scene, and I almost wished I'd been there to see Linda's face. "One more thing," Inspector Rodriguez added. "The construction that's happening there is pretty substantial, looks like a 2-story addition." When I asked the contractor for his license information, he seemed confused about why permits hadn't been pulled. You might have done him a favor too, because he could face penalties for working without permits. After hanging up, I allowed myself a moment of satisfaction. Linda had tried to block my legitimate, permitted, approved construction project, and in doing so, she'd drawn attention to her own unpermitted construction. The irony was delicious. Wednesday morning, I watched from my window as a very angry Linda stormed across the street toward my house. I met her on the front lawn, phone in hand, recording. "You vindictive bastard," she hissed. "You reported me to the city. Do you have any idea what you've done?" "I reported an observed code violation," I said calmly, "just like you threatened to do to me multiple times. The difference is my project actually has all the proper permits and approvals." "This is harassment," she spat. "I'm going to sue you for harassment and defamation." "Defamation requires false statements," I said. "Everything I've reported is documented fact." Speaking of which, have you heard from the Arizona Department of Real Estate yet? I filed a formal complaint about the HOA's financial irregularities on Monday. Her face went from red to nearly purple. "You have no right to access those records." Actually, as a homeowner in the HOA, I have every right. Arizona Revised Statutes, Title 33, Chapter 16 clearly spells out homeowner rights to access association records. You should read it sometime. "My husband is going to destroy you in court," she threatened. "Your husband, who's been receiving payments from the HOA for questionable consulting services." I raised an eyebrow. "I'm sure the state investigators will be very interested in talking to him too." She opened her mouth, closed it, then spun around and marched back to her house. I saved the video recording to my cloud storage, just in case. That afternoon, Marcus called with an update. "The Department of Real Estate has opened an investigation into Pinecrest Estates HOA. They're taking your complaint seriously. They'll be conducting interviews with board members and reviewing financial records. This could take a few months, but they have subpoena power, so Linda can't hide anything." "What happens if they find evidence of fraud?" I asked. "Depends on how serious it is." "They could remove the board, place the HOA under state supervision, impose fines, and refer criminal charges to the county attorney's office. If the evidence is as solid as what you showed me, Linda and possibly Richard could be facing felony charges." The next few days were relatively quiet. Tom finished the framing and started on the decking boards. My new deck was taking shape beautifully, and I couldn't wait to have that first barbecue on it. On Friday, I got home from work to find a letter in my mailbox from the HOA. It was another cease and desist, this time claiming that construction noise was violating quiet hours and disturbing the peace of the neighborhood. The letter cited complaints from multiple neighbors, though it didn't name them. I immediately walked down the street and knocked on doors. The Hendersons, the Patels, the Johnsons, and the Martins, all the nearby neighbors confirmed they hadn't complained about any noise. In fact, most of them complimented how professional and respectful Tom's crew had been. "We barely even notice they're here," Mrs. Henderson said. "And honestly, we're just glad someone is finally standing up to Linda. She's been a tyrant for too long." Armed with signed statements from my neighbors confirming they hadn't complained, I sent a formal response to the HOA, copying Marcus, stating that the noise complaint was fabricated and that I was documenting this as further evidence of harassment. The following Tuesday, I came home to discover Linda had parked her car partially blocking my driveway, preventing Tom's truck from pulling in with a delivery of materials. I called the non-emergency police line and reported a vehicle blocking my driveway. 2 officers arrived 20 minutes later. One of them knocked on Linda's door while the other talked to me. "She does this kind of thing often?" the officer asked, taking notes. "She's been harassing me about a construction project that's fully permitted and approved," I explained. "I have documentation of multiple incidents." Linda came out of her house, all smiles and charm for the police officers. "Oh, officers, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize I was blocking his driveway. I'll move it right away." "Ma'am, you need to be more careful about where you park," the officer said. "Blocking someone's driveway is a civil infraction." "Of course, officer, it won't happen again." But the look she shot me as she got in her car and moved it said this was far from over. The deck was finished on Thursday, 2 weeks after we'd started. It was absolutely gorgeous, exactly what I'd envisioned. Tom and his crew had done impeccable work. The composite decking was a rich brown that complemented my house perfectly. The railings were sturdy and elegant, and the built-in benches I'd requested looked fantastic. "You should be really proud of this," Tom said as we did the final walkthrough. "And honestly, thank you for standing up to that crazy HOA lady. If she'd gotten away with blocking your project, she would have felt empowered to do it to other people too." That evening, Sarah and I christened the new deck with a quiet dinner. We grilled steaks, opened a good bottle of wine, and watched the sunset over the desert landscape. It was perfect. "You know the best part," Sarah said, raising her glass. "Linda has to look at this beautiful deck every day and know that she lost." I laughed and clinked my glass against hers. But the war wasn't over yet. The next week, Linda received another visit from Inspector Rodriguez. I learned about it from Bob Harrison, who'd witnessed the interaction. The inspector told her that she still hasn't applied for the permits she needs, Bob told me while walking his dog past my house. She tried to argue with him, saying the construction was almost done, so what was the point? He told her that didn't matter, and if she didn't submit permit applications within 10 days, the city would take legal action and she'd have to tear down everything she built. "She actually might have to tear it down," I asked. That's what he said. Unpermitted construction can be ordered demolished if it doesn't meet code requirements, and without permits, there's no way to verify if it meets code. I felt a little bad about that, actually. Having to tear down a construction project was a nightmare scenario for any homeowner. But then, I remembered how she tried to do essentially the same thing to me, threatening liens and legal action, trying to force me to tear down my properly permitted deck. My sympathy evaporated. 3 weeks after my deck was finished, I got a call from a state investigator named Jennifer Mills. She wanted to interview me about my complaint against the HOA. We met at a coffee shop in downtown Scottsdale. Jennifer was a serious woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. "I've been reviewing the financial records for Pinecrest Estates, HOA," she said after the preliminaries. "What you uncovered is just the tip of the iceberg. We've found evidence of systematic financial mismanagement and what appears to be embezzlement totaling over $120,000 over a 3-year period." I let out a low whistle. That's more than I thought. Linda Pemberton and her husband have been using the HOA as a personal slush fund. The payments to his consulting company, the legal fees to his firm, the fake pool house renovation, we found at least 6 other fictitious contractor payments where work was never performed. The money all seems to have flowed to accounts controlled by the Pembertons. What happens now? I asked. We're referring the case to the Maricopa County Attorney's Office for criminal prosecution. We're also removing the current board and appointing a temporary management company to run the HOA while new elections are organized. And we're working with a forensic accountant to track down the stolen money and potentially recover it. Will the homeowners get their money back? Possibly some of it, depending on what assets the Pembertons have. We can place liens on their property, garnish wages, that sort of thing. But realistically, it's hard to recover everything in cases like this. Over the following weeks, things moved quickly. The Department of Real Estate issued a public notice to all Pinecrest Estates homeowners informing them of the investigation and the appointment of an interim management company. An emergency HOA meeting was held where residents voted to authorize a special assessment to cover the shortfall in the reserve fund caused by Linda's theft. The anger among homeowners was palpable. Several people stood up at that meeting and shared their own stories of Linda's abuse of power. Mrs. Patterson talked about the shutters incident. The Johnsons, who'd moved out, actually drove back for the meeting to describe how Linda had harassed them. A young couple, the Rodriguezes, described how Linda had tried to fine them for having a vegetable garden that she claimed violated landscaping standards, even though there was no such rule in the guidelines. For years, Linda had terrorized the neighborhood, and now everyone was realizing they could have spoken up sooner. There was a lot of regret mixed in with the anger. In early December, about 2 months after my deck was completed, Linda and Richard Pemberton were arrested. I watched from my window as 2 detectives and several police officers executed a search warrant on their home. They carried out boxes of documents, computers, and files. Linda was led out in handcuffs, still shouting about how this was all a mistake and she was being persecuted. The local news picked up the story. Former HOA president charged with embezzlement ran on the evening broadcast, complete with footage of Linda's perp walk. The reporter detailed how she'd stolen over $120,000 from her neighbors and used her position to intimidate anyone who questioned her authority. The schadenfreude was real, I'll admit. But more than that, I felt a sense of justice. Linda had hurt a lot of people with her tyranny, and now she was finally being held accountable. The criminal case moved through the system slowly, as these things do. Linda and Richard were each charged with multiple felonies: theft, fraud, forgery, and abuse of fiduciary responsibility. Their attorney tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the county attorney's office was pushing for prison time given the scope of the theft and the number of victims. Meanwhile, the city's case against Linda for the unpermitted construction continued on a parallel track. She'd finally applied for permits in November, but the plans she submitted revealed that her addition violated multiple building codes and zoning restrictions. The structure was too close to the property line, exceeded height limits, and had electrical work that didn't meet safety standards. The city gave her 2 options: bring everything up to code, which would require expensive modifications and might not even be possible given the setback violations, or demolish the addition entirely. She chose to fight it, filing appeals and requesting variances. In January, 6 months after this all began, Linda's variance requests were denied by the city's Board of Adjustment. The decision was unanimous. The board noted that allowing such significant violations would set a dangerous precedent, and that Linda's knowing construction without permits showed a blatant disregard for the rules meant to protect public safety. She was ordered to demolish the addition within 60 days, or face daily fines of $1,000 and potential criminal charges for failure to comply with a lawful order. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that Linda and Richard had put their house up for sale. Whether they were planning to flee before trial or just couldn't afford to stay, I wasn't sure. But housing prices in Scottsdale were strong, and their house sold quickly, even with the unpermitted addition that would have to be dealt with. The new owners, a nice couple named the Tanners, hired a demolition crew in March. I watched from my beautiful deck as heavy equipment tore down Linda's illegal addition. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the neighborhood. Linda had tried to stop my legitimate construction project and ended up having her own illegal construction torn down. The criminal trial was scheduled for August. Linda and Richard both pleaded not guilty, apparently planning to argue that Linda had just been confused about HOA finances and hadn't intended to steal anything. It was a weak defense, given the clear paper trail of falsified invoices and the money flowing into their accounts. I'd been subpoenaed to testify about what I'd uncovered in the financial records and about Linda's retaliatory actions against me. Marcus helped me prepare, and I felt confident about my testimony. But in July, just weeks before trial, Linda and Richard changed their pleas to guilty. Apparently their attorney had convinced them they had no chance of acquittal and that pleading guilty might result in a lighter sentence. The sentencing hearing was in September. Sarah and I attended, along with about 20 other residents of Pinecrest Estates. We wanted to see justice done. Linda looked diminished in her courtroom attire, no longer the imperious HOA tyrant, but just a middle-aged woman facing the consequences of her actions. Richard sat beside her, looking resigned. The prosecutor laid out the full scope of their crimes. $127,000 stolen over 3 years, multiple falsified documents, abuse of authority to retaliate against homeowners who questioned them, and an attempt to obstruct the investigation by destroying financial records. That last part was news to me, but apparently Linda had tried to delete files from the HOA's computer system once she realized she was being investigated. Several homeowners gave victim impact statements. Mrs. Patterson described the stress and anxiety Linda's harassment had caused her. Bob Harrison talked about how the theft had depleted the HOA's reserve fund, meaning all the homeowners would have to pay extra assessments to cover necessary maintenance. A young single mother named Tracy described how Linda had tried to fine her repeatedly for minor violations, causing her significant financial hardship. When it was my turn, I kept it simple. Linda Pemberton abused her authority to harass, intimidate, and steal from her neighbors. She tried to ruin my life because I dared to question her. She betrayed the trust of everyone in our community. I hope the court holds her fully accountable. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s named Judge Reeves, listened to everything carefully. Then she addressed Linda and Richard directly. This court has seen many cases of financial fraud, but what makes this particularly egregious is the betrayal of trust. Your neighbors elected you to a position of responsibility. They trusted you to manage their money and act in the community's best interest. Instead, you treated the HOA as your personal piggy bank. You stole from families, from retirees, from people who trusted you. And when someone had the courage to question you, you retaliated with harassment and intimidation. Judge Reeves sentenced Linda to 4 years in state prison and ordered her to pay full restitution of $127,000 plus interest. Richard, whose role had been more passive, received 2 years in prison and was also liable for the restitution. They were both ordered to have no contact with any Pinecrest Estates residents after their release. As the bailiffs led them away, Linda looked back at the courtroom. Her eyes found mine for just a moment. I'd like to say I felt triumph or satisfaction, but mostly I just felt tired. This whole ordeal had been exhausting. Outside the courthouse, several of my neighbors wanted to thank me. "You did what none of us had the courage to do," Mrs. Patterson said, hugging me. "You stood up to her." "I just wanted to build my deck," I said, managing a smile. Everything else came after. Life in Pinecrest Estates slowly returned to normal. The interim management company was professional and responsive, actually fixing the pool house and addressing maintenance issues Linda had ignored. In December, we held elections for a new board. Margaret Chen declined to run again, saying she'd learned her lesson about not speaking up. David Morrison had moved out of the neighborhood entirely. 3 new board members were elected: Bob Harrison, Mrs. Patterson, and a newcomer named Jennifer Wu. Their first act was to review and revise all the HOA rules, removing the vague and overly restrictive provisions Linda had used as weapons. They also implemented new financial controls, including mandatory annual audits by an independent accounting firm and quarterly financial reports to all homeowners. My deck became a neighborhood gathering spot. Sarah and I hosted regular barbecues that summer, inviting neighbors over for food and conversation. It felt good to be part of a community that was healing and moving forward. One evening in late October, almost a year and a half after this all started, I was sitting on my deck watching the sunset when Sarah came out with 2 beers. "I was thinking," she said, settling into the chair next to me. "If Linda hadn't tried to block your contractor that day, none of this would have come to light. She'd probably still be stealing from the HOA and terrorizing the neighborhood." "That's true," I said. "She declared war on me that morning, and it ended up destroying her instead." "Karma," Sarah said, clinking her beer bottle against mine. "Justice," I corrected. "Karma is passive. Justice requires someone to stand up and fight back." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, enjoying the cool evening air and the stunning Arizona sky painted in oranges and purples. My beautiful deck, the one Linda had tried so hard to prevent, had become a symbol of something larger: the idea that ordinary people can stand up to bullies and win. The Pembertons' house had been sold to cover part of the restitution. The HOA had recovered about $80,000 so far, with more potentially coming from wage garnishments after Linda and Richard were released from prison. It wasn't everything, but it was something. More importantly, the culture in our neighborhood had changed. People were more engaged, attending HOA meetings and asking questions. The new board was transparent and accountable. Rules were enforced fairly and consistently, not used as tools of personal vendetta. I sometimes wondered if Linda, sitting in her prison cell, understood what she'd done wrong. Did she see that her reign of terror had been built on stolen money and intimidation? Did she regret trying to block my contractor that Saturday morning, the action that set her downfall in motion? Probably not. People like Linda rarely take responsibility for their actions. They always see themselves as victims, even when they're the ones who caused the harm, but that wasn't my problem anymore. I'd done what I needed to do, stood up for my rights, exposed wrongdoing, and helped bring a criminal to justice. Now I could just enjoy my deck, my girlfriend, and my community. As darkness settled over the neighborhood, Sarah leaned her head on my shoulder. "You know what I love about this deck?" she said softly. "What's that?" "It's not just a deck. It's proof that doing the right thing matters. That one person can make a difference." I kissed the top of her head. "It's also a really nice place to have a beer and watch the sunset," she laughed. That too, in the end, that's what it came down to. I'd wanted to build a deck where I could relax with friends and family. Linda had tried to stop me out of spite and wounded pride. Her war against me had backfired spectacularly, exposing her crimes and ending her tyranny. My deck stood as a testament to the importance of following rules, standing up for what's right, and not letting bullies win. It was built on a foundation of proper permits, honest contractors, and the courage to fight back against corruption. And it was exactly what I'd wanted all along: a beautiful space to enjoy life with the people I cared about. The war Linda declared that Saturday morning in August had ended with her in prison, her reputation destroyed, and her ill-gotten gains seized. Meanwhile, I was grilling burgers on my gorgeous new deck, surrounded by neighbors who'd become friends, part of a community that was stronger for having confronted and overcome a tyrant. Sometimes justice takes time. Sometimes it requires documentation, persistence, and a willingness to stand up when it would be easier to back down. But when it finally comes, when the bully is held accountable and the victims are vindicated, it's worth every difficult moment. I raised my beer bottle toward Linda's old house, where the Tanners were now living peacefully, their property free of illegal additions and HOA drama. "Thanks for declaring war, Linda," I said quietly. "You really should have just let me build my deck." Sarah laughed beside me, and somewhere in the desert night, a coyote howled. Life in Scottsdale was good and my deck was perfect. That's all I'd ever wanted. The autumn air was crisp and comfortable, typical for Arizona in late October. The neighborhood had truly transformed over these months. The holiday season was approaching, and the new HOA board had organized a community-wide Halloween event, something Linda would never have approved because she considered such things beneath her dignity. As I sat there reflecting on everything that had happened, I realized that Linda's biggest mistake hadn't been the embezzlement, though that was certainly serious. Her biggest mistake had been believing that power and intimidation could sustain her forever. She'd forgotten, or perhaps never learned, that communities are built on trust and mutual respect. Every tyrant eventually falls. Some are brought down by external forces, others by their own hubris. Linda's downfall was a combination of both. Her illegal construction, her harassment of me, her financial crimes, they all stemmed from the same source: an absolute belief in her own authority and a complete disregard for rules that applied to everyone else. The decorated deck lights Sarah had insisted we install twinkled on as the timer activated them. They cast a warm glow over the space, making it feel magical. This is what home should feel like, I thought. Safe, comfortable, welcoming. Not a place where you're afraid of your HOA president lurking around corners looking for violations to cite. Several months later, in early spring, I ran into Margaret Chen at the grocery store. We hadn't spoken much since the investigation concluded. "I owe you an apology," she said after we exchanged pleasantries. "I knew something wasn't right with Linda with how she was running things, but I was too afraid to say anything. I let her get away with it for too long. You gave me the financial records when I asked," I pointed out. "That took courage," she shook her head. "Not enough courage. I should have spoken up at board meetings. I should have questioned those payments to Richard's company. I just wanted to avoid conflict." "We all have to live with our choices," I said gently. "But you can make better choices going forward. You could run for the board again if you wanted. People would probably appreciate having someone with institutional knowledge who's learned from past mistakes." She smiled sadly. "Maybe someday. Right now, I'm just glad the neighborhood is in good hands with Bob and the others." That conversation stayed with me. It was easy to blame Linda for everything, and certainly she deserved the bulk of the blame. But her reign of terror had only been possible because people like Margaret and David had enabled it through their silence, because homeowners had been too intimidated to challenge her collectively. Evil doesn't just happen. It requires passive acceptance from good people who choose not to act. I'd been lucky in a way. I had the resources to hire a lawyer, the time to dig through financial records, and the personality to stand up to confrontation. Not everyone had those advantages. Some of my neighbors were elderly or struggling financially or simply not confrontational by nature. They'd suffered under Linda's rule but hadn't known how to fight back. That's why standing up had been so important. Not just for me, but for all of them. By summer, the neighborhood was thriving. The pool house had been fully renovated, this time for real, using the recovered restitution money. It looked fantastic. The landscaping throughout the common areas had been upgraded. Several long-neglected maintenance issues had been addressed. The HOA dues had actually gone down slightly because the board was managing money competently instead of stealing it. Imagine that. Sarah and I got engaged that July on my deck, during a sunset that painted the sky in impossible colors. It seemed fitting that the deck Linda had tried so hard to prevent would be where I started the next chapter of my life. We planned a small wedding for the following spring, right there in my backyard on that deck. It would be intimate, just close friends and family. Several of my neighbors were invited, of course. They'd become part of my life story in ways I never could have predicted. When I sent out the wedding invitations, I included a note thanking people for their support during what I called the HOA situation. I didn't dwell on it, but I wanted people to know their solidarity had mattered. Bob Harrison responded to his invitation with a card that made me laugh. "Glad to celebrate with you on the deck that launched 1,000 subpoenas," he'd written. The legal saga had one final chapter. Linda and Richard's appeals were denied at every level. They were serving their sentences at separate facilities in Arizona. According to the victim's notification system, Linda was scheduled for release in 3 years with good behavior. Richard would be out sooner. Part of their parole conditions would include continued restitution payments. The court had placed liens on any assets they might acquire in the future. They'd be paying for their crimes for decades, probably for the rest of their lives. I didn't take pleasure in their suffering, but I didn't feel sorry for them either. They'd made their choices. Now they were living with the consequences. The wedding, when it came, was perfect. The weather cooperated with clear skies and comfortable temperatures. Sarah looked absolutely stunning in her simple white dress. We'd hired a local caterer who set up a beautiful spread on my deck and in the backyard. As I stood there saying my vows, I looked around at the people gathered on that deck. Friends from college, coworkers, family members who'd traveled from out of state, and my neighbors who'd stood by me during one of the most stressful periods of my life. This deck represented so much more than just a construction project. It was a symbol of integrity, of fighting for what's right, of refusing to be intimidated by bullies. It was the foundation, literally and figuratively, on which I was building my future. During the reception, Bob Harrison raised his glass for a toast. "To the happy couple," he began, "and to the deck that changed our neighborhood. May your marriage be as strong and well-built as this structure, and may you never face another HOA nightmare." Everyone laughed and cheered. It was a perfect moment. As evening settled and string lights twinkled overhead, I pulled Sarah close for a dance. We swayed to soft music while our guests mingled and celebrated around us. "No regrets?" Sarah asked, smiling up at me. "About marrying you? Never." I meant about the whole HOA thing. It was a lot of stress and drama. I thought about it, looking around at the beautiful deck, the happy guests, the community that had emerged stronger from adversity. "No regrets," I said firmly. "Linda declared war, but we won the peace. That's what matters." Life moved forward from there. Sarah moved into my house, bringing her own touches to make it truly ours. The deck became the center of our social life, hosting dinners and game nights and lazy Sunday mornings with coffee and newspapers. The HOA continued functioning smoothly under its new leadership. Property values in Pinecrest Estates actually increased, partly because word got around that the neighborhood had cleaned house and was now well managed. Potential buyers saw it as a positive, a community that took accountability seriously. I eventually learned that Linda had given an interview from prison to a local news outlet. She claimed she'd been unfairly persecuted, that her actions had been misunderstood, that if people had just listened to her side of the story, they'd see she was the real victim. The article was balanced, presenting her claims alongside the facts of her conviction and the evidence against her. Most readers saw through her self-serving narrative. The comments section was brutal, with former Pinecrest residents and other HOA abuse victims sharing their own stories of corrupt board members. Linda's interview had one positive effect. It sparked a broader conversation about HOA oversight and accountability in Arizona. State legislators introduced a bill requiring more stringent financial controls and transparency for HOAs. It passed the following year, making it harder for future Lindas to abuse their positions. So even in defeat, Even while trying to portray herself as a victim, Linda had inadvertently contributed to positive change. The irony wasn't lost on me. Years passed. Sarah and I started a family, welcoming a daughter we named Emma. The deck got a safety gate installed to keep her from tumbling down the stairs when she learned to walk. It got scuff marks from her riding toys and sippy cup stains that wouldn't quite come out. But it remained beautiful, a central part of our home and our lives. Emma's second birthday party was held on that deck, with a dozen toddlers running around while their parents chatted and kept half an eye on the chaos. Mrs. Patterson, now in her late 70s, attended with a gift she'd knitted herself. "This deck has seen so many wonderful moments," she said, watching Emma tear into her presence. "I'm so glad you fought for it." "Me too," I said. "Every single day I'm glad." The neighborhood continued evolving. Some families moved out, new ones moved in. Bob Harrison retired from the HOA board, having served his term, and was replaced by a young tech worker named Aaron, who brought fresh ideas about online communication and digital record-keeping. The pool house remained beautiful, a testament to what could be accomplished with honest management and proper oversight. The community pool itself was renovated a few years later, funded by HOA reserves that had been properly maintained and invested. I occasionally gave interviews to local news outlets doing stories about HOA reform, always emphasizing the importance of homeowner vigilance and engagement. "Read your bylaws," I'd tell people. "Attend meetings. Ask questions. Don't let fear of conflict prevent you from holding leaders accountable." Some people took that advice to heart. I heard from homeowners in other neighborhoods who'd uncovered financial irregularities in their own HOAs, inspired by my story to dig deeper and demand transparency. Several corrupt boards across Arizona were exposed and removed in the years following Linda's conviction. One man, Roger from a subdivision in Chandler, emailed me to say he'd discovered his HOA president had been awarding landscaping contracts to his brother-in-law at inflated prices. Following the playbook I'd outlined in interviews, Roger had documented everything, filed complaints with state authorities, and gotten the entire board removed. His neighborhood was recovering, much like Pinecrest Estates had. These stories reminded me that individual actions can ripple outward in unexpected ways. I just wanted to build my deck, but the fight that ensued had helped spark a movement toward greater HOA accountability across the state. Emma grew older, started school, made friends. The deck hosted countless playdates, birthday parties, and family dinners. It weathered monsoon storms and blazing summer heat, requiring occasional maintenance but remaining structurally sound. Sarah and I would sometimes sit out there after Emma was asleep, enjoying the quiet evening air and reflect on how far we'd come. The deck where I'd proposed, where we'd gotten married, where we were raising our daughter, it had become more than just a physical structure. It was a symbol of our life together, built on a foundation of integrity and courage. Linda was released from prison after serving most of her sentence. I only knew because I was still signed up for victim notifications. She moved to Nevada, as far as I could tell, probably seeking a fresh start where people didn't know her history. Richard had gotten out earlier and apparently moved to Colorado. They were no longer together, their marriage another casualty of their crimes. The restitution payments continued, automatically deducted from their wages whenever they were employed. I never saw or heard from either of them again. They became footnotes in my life story, cautionary tales I'd occasionally share when the topic came up. But mostly, I didn't think about them. They'd lost their power over me the moment they were held accountable. The years kept rolling by. Emma grew into a smart, confident girl who loved science and soccer. The deck acquired more memories. The afternoon she caught her first, and only, butterfly there, the evening Sarah told me she was pregnant with our second child, the countless meals and conversations and moments of everyday life. I refinished the deck when Emma was 8, giving it a fresh coat of sealant and replacing a few boards that had warped over time. As I worked, I thought about that Saturday morning so many years ago when Linda had stormed across the street to declare war on my contractor. If I could go back and talk to my younger self, standing there with coffee in hand, watching Linda approach with fury in her eyes, what would I say? Probably just this. Stand firm, document everything, trust in justice, it's going to be okay. Because it was okay. Better than okay, actually. The conflict had been stressful and time-consuming, but it had resulted in positive change for an entire community. It had exposed corruption, led to reforms, and inspired others to stand up against abuses of power. And it had given me this beautiful deck, this space where my family's life unfolded in countless small, precious moments. On a perfect October evening, 14 years after Linda had tried to block my contractor, I stood on my deck watching the sunset. Sarah was inside helping Emma with homework. Our son, Jake, now 5 years old, was playing with toy trucks on the deck boards, making engine noises. The neighborhood around me was peaceful and well-maintained. The HOA functioned efficiently under the leadership of engaged, honest board members. Property values had steadily climbed. Pinecrest Estates was a desirable place to live. None of that would have been possible if someone hadn't stood up to Linda Pemberton all those years ago. And while I'd been the catalyst, the real credit belonged to everyone who'd supported the effort. Marcus, who'd provided legal expertise. Tom, who'd continued working despite the harassment. My neighbors, who'd provided statements and evidence. The state investigators, who'd taken the complaint seriously. The prosecutors, who'd pursued justice. Change requires a community, not just an individual. I'd learned that lesson well. Jake looked up at me. "Daddy, why are you smiling?" "Just thinking about how lucky we are," I said, ruffling his hair. "Because of our deck?" he asked. He'd heard the story before in kid-friendly versions about how Daddy had to be very brave to make sure we could have this deck. "Because of our deck," I agreed. "And because of a lot of other things too." He nodded seriously, then went back to his trucks. I looked across the street at what used to be Linda's house. The current owners, a retired couple with grown children, had lived there for over a decade now. They were lovely people, active in the neighborhood, always friendly and helpful. No trace remained of Linda's presence, of her illegal addition or her reign of terror. She'd been erased from this place, replaced by better people and better memories. That's how it should be. Communities should grow and improve, learning from past mistakes, refusing to tolerate abuse or corruption. The price of peace is eternal vigilance, someone wise once said. That applied to neighborhoods just as much as to nations. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, I felt a deep sense of contentment. This deck, this home, this life, it was everything I'd fought for and more. Linda Pemberton had declared war that Saturday morning in August, 14 years ago. She tried to use her power to destroy me for having the audacity to challenge her authority. Instead, I'd stood my ground, exposed her crimes, and helped build a better community in the aftermath of her downfall. My deck stood as a monument to that victory, a constant reminder that doing the right thing, no matter how difficult, is always worth it in the end. Justice had prevailed. The bully had been defeated. The community had healed and thrived. And I had my perfect deck, exactly as I'd always wanted it, the place where my family's best memories were made. That's a happy ending if I've ever lived one.